Welcome, I'm Jeremy. The ocean's whispering out there, waves rolling gentle against the cliffs and a soft sea breeze carrying the scent of salt. I've got a story for you, one that takes us to a forgotten highway near the sea, where a woman named Nina waits with a lamp, and a hope she never speaks aloud. Let's step into her world. The highway stretched long and forgotten on the outskirts of a desert town, its cracked pavement running parallel to a coastal cliff where the ocean murmured far below. Nothing grew nearby but yellowed weeds, their brittle stalks swaying in the dry wind, and telephone poles, their wires sagging under the weight of years. Every 20 miles, the same markers appeared like ghosts of another time. An old gas station with pumps that hadn't worked in decades, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a junkyard filled with rusted hulks, and a sun-bleached billboard for a soft drink no one had tasted since the 80s. Its colors faded to a whisper of what they'd been. Beyond the cliff, the sea stretched endless, its waves a quiet heartbeat against the rocks, a sound that carried on the wind to the highway above. Nina Lowe lived in a rust-colored trailer behind a service station that hadn't seen real traffic since the bypass was built 17 years ago. She was 65 now, her hair gray and pulled back in a loose bun, her hands weathered from years of desert sun and salt air. The trailer sat perched on a patch of hard-packed dirt, just close enough to the cliff to hear the ocean's sigh on still nights, its windows fogged with dust and sea spray. Every evening, as the sky turned to rust and the waves below grew louder, Nina lit a green glass lamp and set it beside the highway, its glow soft against the fading light. She didn't say why, not out loud, but she did it just in case. Her routine was simple, worn into her like the grooves in the pavement outside. She swept the dust off the trailer's small porch, the broom kicking up clouds that mingled with the salty breeze from the sea. She checked the oil in the pump she never used, its handle rusted stiff, the motion more habit than necessity. Then she brewed weak tea on the stovetop, the kettle rattling as the sky outside her window deepened to the color of the trailer's walls, the ocean's waves a steady rhythm in the distance. She moved through these tasks quietly, her steps slow, her eyes distant, as if she were listening for something, or someone. Inside the trailer, a map hung on the kitchen wall, its edges curled from the damp air, covered in push pins that marked the years. Red for strangers who'd stopped to ask for directions, back when the highway still saw travelers. Blue for couples with engine trouble, their voices sharp with frustration as they waited for help that never came. Yellow for the nights when no one passed at all, which was most nights now. Nina added to the map without thinking, her fingers steady as she pressed a new pin into the paper, her eyes tracing the patterns of a life that had grown quieter with each passing year. But there was one pushpin that didn't fit the pattern, a black one, solitary in the corner of the map. It marked Caleb. He'd left 17 years ago, riding shotgun in someone else's truck, his face hard with anger, his words reckless and sharp as he'd slammed the door. He never came back, and Nina never reported him missing. She didn't call the police, didn't ask questions, didn't chase after him. She just started lighting the lamp every evening without fail. Its green glow a beacon against the desert dark, and the ocean's endless song. The green glass lamp flickered softly as Nina set it down beside the highway, its glow casting a faint emerald light across the cracked pavement, a small defiance against the deepening dusk. The desert stretched endless around her, yellowed weeds whispering in the dry wind, telephone poles standing like silent sentinels along the road. Beyond the coastal cliff, the ocean's waves rolled in a steady rhythm, their sound carrying up to the bluff where Nina's rust-colored trailer sat, its windows fogged with dust and sea spray. The sky above was a bruised shade of orange, the sun sinking into the sea, painting the horizon with streaks of fire that reflected on the water below. Nina stood by the lamp for a moment, her hands steady despite the years, her gray hair catching the last of the light as she turned back toward the trailer. The map on her kitchen wall stayed with her, a quiet weight in her mind, its pushpins a record of nothing and everything all at once. The black one in the corner, Caleb's, sat heavier than the rest, a reminder of the night he'd left, his anger a storm that had blown through the trailer and out into the desert, leaving her with silence and the sound of the ocean in its wake. She didn't dwell on it, not anymore, but she felt it, the way you feel a bruise you've grown used to. Inside, she poured herself another cup of weak tea, the kettle's rattle blending with the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. The trailer smelled of salt and dust, the air heavy with the memory of years spent waiting. She sat at the small table by the window, the map on the wall behind her, and sipped her tea, her eyes on the lamp outside as its light held steady against the growing dark. The ocean's song was louder now, a gentle lullaby that mingled with the wind, and for a moment, Nina let herself listen, let herself imagine it was carrying something back to her. That night, as she washed her single plate in the sink, the water cold against her hands, she saw something flicker in the corner of her vision, down by the lamp. She paused, her hands still in the basin, and turned her head, squinting through the window. The lamp's green glow was steady, but something moved in its light, a shadow that didn't belong to the weeds or the wind. Nina dried her hands on her apron, her movements slow but sure, and stepped outside, the porch creaking under her weight, the ocean's breeze cool against her face. The highway was empty, as it always was, the pavement stretching into the dark, the cliff's edge a faint line where the desert met the sea. She walked to the lamp, her boots crunching on the gravel, and knelt beside it, her fingers hovering over the glass. There was no one there, no figure, no sound but the waves and the wind. But the lamp was warm to the touch, as though someone had cupped it in their hands, holding it close. Nina's breath caught, just for a moment, and she looked out toward the ocean, where the moonlight shimmered on the water, a silver path leading to the horizon. She didn't move the lamp. She just knelt there, the warmth of the glass seeping into her fingers, and whispered, "Wrong night, sweetheart. Try again tomorrow." Her voice was soft, barely louder than the waves below, but it carried a hope she hadn't spoken in years. She stood, her knees creaking, and turned back to the trailer, the lamp's glow steady behind her, a small light against the vastness of the desert and the sea. The desert highway lay quiet under the stars, its cracked pavement reflecting the faint green glow of the lamp Nina had left beside the road. The ocean beyond the coastal cliff whispered steadily, waves rolling against the rocks below, their rhythm a soft heartbeat in the night. Yellowed weeds swayed in the dry wind, brushing against the telephone poles that lined the road, their shadows long and thin in the moonlight. The rust-colored trailer sat on the bluff, its windows dark now, the sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and dust across the porch where Nina had stood moments before. She climbed the steps back into the trailer, her boots heavy on the creaking wood, the warmth of the lamp still lingering on her fingertips. The air inside was cool, the faint tang of tea still hanging in the space, and the map on the kitchen wall seemed to watch her as she closed the door behind her. She didn't look at it, not yet, but the black pushpin in the corner burned in her mind, a solitary mark for Caleb, a reminder of the night he'd left and the years she'd waited. The ocean's song filtered through the cracked window, a distant lullaby that mingled with the memory of the lamp's warmth. And Nina felt something shift inside her, a quiet stirring she hadn't felt in years. She didn't turn on the light as she settled into her chair by the window, the darkness of the trailer wrapping around her like a blanket. Outside, the lamp's glow held steady, a small beacon against the desert dark and the endless sea beyond. Nina closed her eyes, her hands resting in her lap, and let the sound of the waves carry her into sleep, their rhythm steady and slow, a promise of something she couldn't name. That night, she dreamed of Caleb, not as he'd been when he left, angry and reckless, his words sharp as the slamming door, but as a child, small and soft in the back seat of her old car. In the dream, Caleb was asleep, his head against the window, a half-eaten bag of pretzels in his lap, a crayon clutched in his small fist. The car smelled of sun-warmed vinyl and salt air, the ocean stretching out beyond the highway they'd driven along so many times. Nina could hear the waves, the same ones that rolled below the bluff now, and she reached back to brush a strand of hair from Caleb's face, her fingers gentle, her heart full in a way it hadn't been since he'd gone. He stirred but didn't wake, a small smile on his lips, and the dream held her there in that moment, until the first light of dawn crept through the trailer's window. When Nina woke, the air was cool, the ocean's song softer now, the waves a gentle murmur as the tide pulled back. She sat up, her joints stiff, and noticed something on the floor by the door, a crumpled candy wrapper, its edges damp with sea spray, the label faded but unmistakable. It was a brand that hadn't been made in years, one Caleb used to steal from the diner down the road, sneaking the bright wrappers into his pockets with a grin. Nina bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling just a little, and held it to the light, the ocean's glow through the window catching the faded colors. She didn't cry, but her chest tightened, a mix of hope and ache that felt like the waves themselves, pulling her in and out with the tide. The morning light crept over the desert highway, soft and pale, casting long shadows from the telephone poles and yellowed weeds that lined the road. The ocean beyond the coastal cliff shimmered under the rising sun, its waves a gentle rhythm against the rocks below, their sound carrying up to the bluff where Nina's rust-colored trailer stood. The green glass lamp still glowed faintly beside the highway, its light dimmer now in the dawn, a quiet sentinel that had burned through the night. The air smelled of salt and dust, the sea breeze mingling with the dry heat of the desert, and in the distance, the sun-bleached billboard for a forgotten soft drink caught the light. Its colors a ghost of what they'd once been. Nina stood on the porch of her trailer, the crumpled candy wrapper still in her hand, its damp edges curling from the sea spray that had clung to it overnight. She turned it over, her fingers tracing the faded logo, her mind tracing back to the days when Caleb would run in from the diner down the road, his pockets stuffed with those same wrappers, his grin bright as the sun on the water. The memory ached, sharp and tender, and the dream from the night before lingered. Caleb asleep in the back seat, a crayon in his fist, the ocean stretching endless beside them. She looked out at the sea now, its horizon a thin line of gold, and felt the weight of the wrapper in her hand, a question she couldn't answer. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel, and walked to the lamp, kneeling beside it as she had the night before. The glass was cool now, the warmth from last night gone. But as she reached to pick it up, she noticed something in the sand nearby. Footprints, small and faint, leading from the lamp toward the cliff's edge and then vanishing, as if whoever had made them had stepped into the sea itself. Nina's breath caught, her eyes following the trail, her heart a heavy drumbeat in her chest. They weren't her prints, and no one else had passed this way in years. The ocean's waves seemed to whisper louder for a moment, their rhythm a call she couldn't ignore. She stood, the candy wrapper still in her hand, and walked back to the trailer, her steps slow, her mind turning over the same questions that had haunted her since the lamp had grown warm. Was Caleb dead, his spirit carried back by the desert and the sea? Had he come back, a man now, leaving these small signs for her to find? Was she losing her mind, seeing things in the haze of her own longing? Or was the desert, with its endless sands and the ocean's endless pull, simply returning what it had borrowed all those years ago? She didn't know, but the ache in her chest felt different now. Not just grief, but something softer, something like hope. Inside the trailer, Nina set the candy wrapper on the table beside her teacup, its faded colors catching the light through the window. She turned to the map on the wall, its pushpins a record of her quiet years, red, blue, yellow, and the solitary black one in the corner for Caleb. She reached into the small tin where she kept the pins, her fingers brushing over the colors, and paused. The black pin had marked Caleb's absence for 17 years, a wound she'd never spoken aloud. But now, with the wrapper and the footprints and the dream, she felt something shift. The ocean's song filtered through the window, a gentle reminder of the tide's pull, and Nina made a choice. The desert highway stretched into the morning light, its cracked pavement a faded gray against the sandy earth, yellowed weeds trembling in the breeze that carried the ocean's salt up from the cliff below. The waves rolled in a steady rhythm, their sound a soft undercurrent to the stillness of the bluff where Nina's rust-colored trailer stood, its windows catching the sun's first rays. The green glass lamp sat beside the road, its glow extinguished now. The sand around it still marked by those faint footprints that led toward the cliff and vanished, as if swallowed by the sea. The sun-bleached billboard in the distance loomed like a forgotten memory, its faded soft drink and peeling away while the ocean beyond shimmered gold. a mirror for the sky's slow fire. Nina stood by the map on her kitchen wall, the candy wrapper on the table behind her, its faded colors a quiet echo of the dream that still lingered in her mind. Caleb in the back seat, a crayon in his fist, the ocean stretching beside them. The footprints outside, small and fleeting, felt like a continuation of that dream, a thread connecting the boy she'd lost to the woman she'd become. She held a new pushpin in her hand, its color a vibrant green, brighter than the others, and her fingers trembled as she pressed it into the map just below the black one that marked Caleb's leaving. The green pin stood out, a small act of hope, a marker for something new. Something she couldn't name but felt in her bones, as steady as the waves below. She turned to the window, her gray hair catching the light, and looked out at the lamp by the road, the footprints still visible in the sand. The questions that had haunted her since the lamp grew warm were still there. Was Caleb dead? Had he come back? Was she losing her mind? But they felt softer now, less like thorns and more like the tide, ebbing and flowing with the ocean's rhythm. The sea breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying the scent of salt and the faint cry of a gull, and Nina felt a calm settle over her, a quiet certainty that whatever the desert and the ocean were returning, it was hers to hold. She stepped outside, her boots steady on the porch, and walked to the lamp, picking it up with care. The glass was cool now, its warmth from the night before a memory, but the footprints in the sand hadn't faded, their small shapes a mystery she didn't need to solve. Not yet. She carried the lamp back to the trailer, setting it on the table beside the candy wrapper, and began her routine anew. Sweeping the dust from the porch, checking the oil in the pump she never used, brewing weak tea on the stovetop. The ocean's waves were a constant companion, their sound a gentle hum as the day unfolded, and Nina moved through it all with a quiet purpose, her eyes returning often to the green pin on the map. The sun climbed higher over the desert highway, its light warming the cracked pavement and casting shadows from the telephone poles that lined the road, their wires sagging under the weight of years. The yellowed weeds swayed in the breeze, their brittle stalks brushing against the sand, while the ocean beyond the cliff sparkled under the midday sun, its waves a steady murmur against the rocks below. The rust-colored trailer on the bluff stood quiet, its windows fogged with dust and sea spray, the green glass lamp now resting on the table inside, beside the crumpled candy wrapper and the teacup Nina had left behind. The map on the kitchen wall held its new green push pin, a small burst of color beneath the black one for Caleb, a marker of hope in a life of waiting. Nina stood on the porch, her hands resting on the railing, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun that caught the sea breeze. The ocean stretched endless before her, its horizon a thin line of blue beneath the sky's pale gold, and the sound of the waves filled the air, a soothing rhythm that seemed to carry the weight of her years. The footprints by the lamp were still there, faint but clear, leading toward the cliff and vanishing, as if whoever had left them had stepped into the sea itself. She didn't try to follow them, didn't look for more signs, but she felt them, the way she felt the green pin on the map. A quiet presence, a possibility she hadn't dared to imagine in 17 years. As the day faded into evening, the sky turning to rust once more, Nina moved with the same steady purpose she always had. She swept the porch again, the broom kicking up dust that mingled with the salt air, and checked the pump, its handle as rusted as ever. She brewed her tea, the kettle rattling on the stovetop, and watched the ocean's horizon glow with the setting sun, its waves a soft counterpoint to the desert's stillness. But tonight felt different. The air heavier with something she couldn't name. A feeling that made her hands pause as she reached for the lamp. She lit the green glass lamp with a match, its flame catching quickly, and carried it outside, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked to the highway. The ocean's waves seemed louder now, their rhythm a call that echoed in her chest, and the sky above was a deep orange, the light reflecting on the water like a path to somewhere else. Nina set the lamp down beside the road, its glow soft and steady, and stepped back, her eyes on the horizon where the desert met the sea. Behind her, something faint, just a shape, moved through the heat haze, shimmering where the ocean's mist rose from the cliff. But she didn't turn to look, not yet. The lamp's green glow held steady beside the desert highway, a small light against the deepening dusk, its reflection catching on the cracked pavement and the yellowed weeds that whispered in the breeze. The ocean beyond the cliff rolled in a gentle rhythm, waves crashing softly against the rocks below, their sound a quiet lullaby that carried up to the bluff where Nina stood. The sky was a bruised shade of orange, the last of the sun sinking into the sea, painting the horizon with streaks of fire that shimmered on the water. The rust-colored trailer sat behind her, its windows dark. The map inside marked with a new green pushpin, a symbol of hope, a quiet belief that Caleb, or some piece of him, had returned. Nina stood by the lamp, her gray hair catching the fading light, her hands steady at her sides. The shape in the heat haze behind her didn't move closer, didn't speak, but she felt it there, a presence as real as the footprints in the sand, as real as the candy wrapper on her table, as real as the dream of Caleb asleep in the back seat. She didn't turn to look, didn't need to. She knew it was him, or the memory of him, carried back by the desert and the ocean's tide, a gift from the years she'd waited. The waves below seemed to hum with it, their rhythm a confirmation, a promise that what was lost could be found again, even if only in echoes. She knelt beside the lamp one last time, her fingers brushing the glass, its warmth a faint echo of the night before, and whispered, "I'll be here tomorrow, sweetheart." Her voice was soft, barely louder than the waves, but it carried a certainty she'd held on to for 17 years. She stood, her boots steady on the gravel, and walked back to the trailer, the lamp's glow a beacon behind her, a light for Caleb, for her, for whatever the desert and the sea might bring next.